think I needed a couple moments to set up the AV there. We're good? All right. Awesome. Well, good morning, Joy City Church. It's always a pleasure and a blessing to be able to stand up here to speak in front of you all. So to start off today, I have a question for all of you. How much is enough for you? How much money and material possessions do you need to consider where you have enough? We discussed this question recently in a study that we did during Engage Ministries, and it really caused me to do some self-reflection to be able to figure out, how do I answer this question for myself? So to start off, let's take a look at the dictionary definition of enough. What does enough mean? How is it defined? So from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, enough, occurring in such quantity or quality or scope as to fully meet demands, needs, or expectations. And a synonym of enough, sufficient, also the definition of that, enough to meet the needs of a situation or a proposed end. So after seeing these definitions, does it kind of give you a better idea of what does it mean to have enough for you? Maybe. So I'm going to talk about a study that was done by Nobel economists Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton in 2010, which concluded that after you get past an annual income of $75,000, making more money after that does not contribute to additional happiness. So in today's dollars adjusted for inflation, that's about $100,000 of annual income. So after about $100,000 per year, if you make any more money, it doesn't contribute to any additional happiness, is what their study found. So there is an upper limit to the amount of happiness that money will contribute to our lives. The same can be said of really good things. So I've heard of some people say, oh, you can never have too much of a good thing, but I beg to differ. Say, take vacations as an example. I don't know about you, but I love taking vacations. In fact, a common display of wealth in our society today is how lavish, extravagant, and frequent our vacations are. So I like to take a vacation once a year to just unwind, relax, and recharge. But my in-laws, they like to take vacations very frequently now that they're retired. They are always on vacation. And when I tell my friends about this, they always tell me how jealous they are of that, because that's exactly what they want to be doing when they retire. So basically, they're working their entire lives to save up enough money so that when they retire, they can take as many vacations as they want. But there is a 2012 study published in the Journal of Happiness Studies that said that the enjoyment that you get from a vacation peaks on about the 8th day. And after that, your enjoyment levels start to go down. And that's because the novelty of the experience starts to wane and you begin to normalize the experience. So there is also a point where you can take too much vacation. So there's an upper limit where if you take any vacation beyond that, you're not really going to enjoy it anymore. Warren Buffett, the greatest investor of our time, has a really good piece of advice for us. Never risk what you have and need for what you don't have and don't need. So what does he mean by this? I'm going to illustrate this point to you. So I'm going to tell you a story about a man named Rajat Gupta. He was a man who achieved remarkable things in his life. So Rajat Gupta was born in Kolkata, India, It's one of the poorest cities in the entire country of India. He was orphaned as a teenager, so he came from a very humble background. But what he went on to achieve in his life and throughout his career is truly phenomenal. A true rags to riches story. By his mid-40s, he was the CEO of McKinsey. So for those of you who don't know McKinsey, it's one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the world. It's like the Google of consulting firms. So if you were a business student who got a job at McKinsey, you could basically go on to have any job that you wanted after that. He retired in 2007, and after retirement, he took on a role with the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. He partnered with Bill Gates, and he sat on the boards of 5 public companies. From the slums of Kolkata to one of the most successful businessmen alive, everybody would say that he had a phenomenal career, and he would be considered wildly successful by almost anybody's standards. By 2008, he had a net worth of 100 million US dollars. He was a centimillionaire. But being a centimillionaire wasn't enough for him. He wanted to be a billionaire. When Gupta was on the board of directors of Goldman Sachs, which is one of the world's most prestigious banks, he had insider knowledge about a large deal that was going on in the bank. With that knowledge in hand, he phoned up his friend and told his friend that secret information before it went public, and his friend bought a large amount of shares in Goldman Sachs and resultantly made $17 million of profits from that secret information. This was later discovered by the authorities, and both Gupta and his friend went to jail for insider trading, and their careers and reputations were ruined. From one of the most spectacular careers ever to being thrown in jail and losing everything, the question we're all wondering is, why are people who have millions of dollars so desperate for money that they would risk everything that they had? Why did Gupta, who is already worth $100 million, want even more money? Because he didn't have a sense of what was enough. To make money that he didn't have and didn't need, he risked what he did have and did need. It was just plain foolish. If you risk something that is important to you for something that is not, it just doesn't make any sense. Enough is not too little. Enough is realizing the opposite, that the insatiable appetite for more will push you to the point of your regret. The only way to know how much food you can eat is to eat until you're sick. But very few people actually try this because vomiting in the end hurts way more than any meal is enjoyable. Coming from an immigrant family, my parents had $200 in their pocket when they first came to the country. And growing up, I was constantly fed the message that my parents had given up their entire lives for me to come to this country so that I could have a better life. My parents were very well-educated professionals with good jobs when they left China. And if they had stayed there, they probably would have built a very successful life for themselves by the world's standards. So all of my parents' hopes and dreams and the weight of their expectations were constantly on my shoulders throughout my childhood when I was growing up. So I felt like that I had to have high achievement in my career and make lots of money in order to make sure that my parents' sacrifice was worth it. I think you're going to hear a very similar story from a lot of immigrant families. And particularly for Chinese immigrant families, their preferred professions for their children are doctor, lawyer, engineer, accountant, basically the professions that sound prestigious. And that's because those are the professions that tend to be well paid and well respected. And if you end up in one of those professions, then in their minds, you have made it. and you are successful. And so that was their definition of having enough. When I was going through my studies in university, on my journey to becoming an accountant, my goal in my undergrad was to get an internship with one of the big four accounting firms because they were the largest and the most prestigious. So I worked extremely hard throughout all of my undergrad university to achieve that. And in the end, I did get an internship with the Big Four, and I did end up getting a job there for my first full-time job, and I ended up working there. Out of the thousands of business students who apply, they only choose the top few to hire. So even getting a job was pretty difficult already. So when I got that initial job offer, I was ecstatic, over the moon, because I had achieved my single most important goal in university. My parents were so proud of me. I instilled the envy of my peers, and at that moment, I thought that I had made it. However, after I started my job at the firm, my goalpost moved. Because I was a junior entry-level employee, I saw that there were many senior partners at the firm who had better and higher paying jobs than me. And I also came to know a lot of successful people who had left that firm for more prestigious and higher paying jobs. So for much of my time that I was working at the firm, I worked extremely hard to be a top performer so that I could score the next promotion and get the next big paycheck. And then when I landed my next job, which was a promotion from my previous job, I got the feeling again that I had made it. But after a few years on that job, I got the same feeling again. I once again saw peers who had higher paying and more prestigious jobs than I did, and I wanted an even more prestigious job and an even higher paycheck. So it was just a vicious cycle of feeling like I never had enough and I always wanted more. In my current role, I am the most senior member of my team, the one with the fanciest title and the highest paycheck. However, there are many people I know who work for more prestigious companies and who make more money than me. And so if I continue down this path of finding people who are more successful and more rich than I am by the world's standards, then I am going to be continuously miserable, and it's going to be a never-ending journey. And I would just feel like I never had enough. No matter how much money that we have and how many material possessions that we accumulate, we can still feel that it is not enough, because every time we get to the next level, our goalpost moves, never feeling like we're satisfied in life and always chasing after something. So this leads us to the question, how do we, as followers of Christ, know that we have enough, that what we have is sufficient? Well, we can turn to the Bible to find out. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, the Apostle Paul tells us that the Lord gave him this tip. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you." God said that his grace is enough for us. We don't need anything else. Christ is enough for us. Do we truly live our lives as if Christ is enough for us? What if we simplified our lives? Would we appreciate what we have more? What if we came from a place and an attitude of sufficiency? Living here in Canada, we know that we have enough food to eat, we have clothing to wear, we have a shelter to live in, we have safety from war and persecution. Everything else that we have is a bonus. My daughter Lexi, she has so many toys that she could play with a different toy every single day of the week and still not play with them all. And because of that, she doesn't appreciate what she has. She has a house full of toys and doesn't want to play with any of them. All she wants to do is just watch shows on her tablet. When I was her age, I didn't even have 1% of the toys that she had, but I used and appreciated everything that I had, and life was much simpler. My challenge to all of us: can we examine our lives and find ways to simplify it? Would we appreciate what we have more if we had less? In our modern society, we relentlessly pursue wealth, success, and material possessions in order to be happy. But we look to the advice, once again, of the Apostle Paul, who offers us a different perspective. Paul has learned the secret of being content in every situation, whether in times of abundance or scarcity. And he gives us a great lesson on God's sufficiency in Philippians 4:12-13. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Contentment is not contingent upon our external circumstances, but it is a state of our hearts. Paul's contentment is deeply rooted in his relationship with Christ. He acknowledges that it's through Christ who strengthens him that he is able to find contentment in all circumstances. As followers of Christ, it's in him that we find true satisfaction and fulfillment. Up until now, I've been talking about living from the perspective of having enough because we have Christ in our lives. But I have also lived on the other end of the extreme, where I felt guilty for having too much. And this goes back to my background of being an early immigrant to Canada. So my mom and dad were fortunate enough to leave China in the early 1990s. But I have a lot of other extended family members who are not so fortunate. I have family members in China, and some of them are in extreme poverty and need. And every time that I am told of their situation, my heart aches for them, that they don't have the life that I have, and that they have no way of getting out of poverty, and that they don't have the privilege of having the religious freedom to be able to know Christ. And as a result, I would feel guilty every time that I spent any money on myself for my own enjoyment, because how dare I enjoy nice things when there are so many other people in this world who are in need and who are suffering? How dare I allow myself to experience luxury when there are others in this world who are suffering so much? Most of us living in Canada are considered rich because we Canadians are richer than most of the world's population. Does this mean that we should feel guilty that we have so much, that we live in this country where there's peace and prosperity, and we don't have to worry about what we're going to eat or what we're going to wear? The good news is that the Bible also shows those of us who are considered to be rich in material possessions how to live our lives. We go back again to the teachings of Paul in 1 Timothy 6:17-19. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Paul warns us against the dangers of arrogance and placing our hope in wealth, which is fleeting and uncertain. In a society consumed by the pursuit of material possessions, it is easy to become trapped by the temptation of wealth and to trust it as our source of security and significance. Instead of placing our hope in wealth, Paul tells us to put our hope in God, who richly provides us with everything that we need. True wealth is not found in the abundance of our possessions, but in our relationship with Jesus. When we recognize God as the source of our provision, we can experience true contentment and fulfillment. Paul tells us wealthy people to be rich in good deeds, to be generous, and to be willing to share. By using our wealth to bless others and to advance God's kingdom, we lay up treasure for ourselves in eternity. So, to answer the question, should we feel guilty every time that we buy something nice for ourselves? I don't think that's God's intention for us. I want to tell you a story of Lydia from the Bible. Some of you may have heard of her. So you can read about her in Acts 16:13-15. Lydia was a very wealthy woman, and you will see how her story differed drastically from that of Rajat Gupta, who I talked about earlier. In the Bible, Lydia is called a dealer in purple cloth and a worshiper of God. Lydia was a successful businesswoman who sold luxury textiles dyed purple. In biblical times, it was only the wealthy who wore garments dyed purple or who had purple furnishings in their homes. After listening to Paul, Lydia and her household were baptized. Lydia also invites Paul and his companions to come and stay at her home. If she could freely invite people to her home on such short notice, then she must have been the owner and the mistress of her own home. There is no mention of a husband or a father in the verses that talk about Lydia. This was quite unusual in biblical times because women were usually identified by their relationship to a man. It's likely that Lydia had no surviving adult male relatives, or she was widowed or divorced. Lydia's home was spacious. It was large enough to accommodate her own household, as well as Paul and his fellow missionaries. Those who would have traveled with Paul could have been Silas, Timothy, Luke, and others. Her home was also large enough to hold church meetings. It was in Lydia's house that the church in Philippi first gathered. So she had a really large house. We know that the Lord opened Lydia's heart to Paul's gospel message, giving her the gifts and the spiritual abilities to help her in her ministry to the early church. She is most likely the person to have led and cared for the first congregation at Philippi. So, Lydia was a woman who was very wealthy, the leader of her household, who owned large property, and she used her material wealth that God had given her to bless the church in Philippi and to bless Paul and his fellow missionaries. Here is a perfect example of someone who was wealthy and who used her wealth for God's glory. Contrast that to Rajat Gupta, who I spoke about earlier. Both Gupta and Lydia were very wealthy, and they both had a lot of influence in their communities, being well-respected business people. Gupta used his wealth and influence to try to get even more wealth for himself, and in the end, because of his greed, he lost everything. Whereas Lydia used her wealth and influence to glorify God and to serve others. Gupta did not have a sense of what was enough, so he kept wanting more. But Lydia knew that she had more than enough, so she gave and shared what she had generously. And most importantly, it's Jesus that's the difference, because it's Jesus that changes our hearts. Gupta was not a Jesus follower, but Lydia was, and Jesus was able to give her a sense of having enough. The lesson here is that if we happen to be blessed with wealth, and most of us living in Canada are, we don't have to feel guilty that we have so much more than the billions of other people in this world who are suffering and who have less than us. We can use our wealth to glorify God, to give generously, and to serve others. In summary, recognize that because we have Jesus, we have enough. His grace is sufficient for us. Everything that he has given to us beyond our needs is a bonus, and we can use his blessings for us to bless others. Whether we have a little or a lot, Let us trust in God's provision and be content with what he has entrusted to us. Our security doesn't lie in our bank accounts, but in the faithful promises of our Father. And I just want to share some actions for all of us to take away. First, cultivate a grateful heart. Take time each day to count our blessings and to express gratitude to God for his provision. Cultivating a spirit of thankfulness shifts our focus from what we lack to what we have been given. And if we find ourselves blessed with material wealth, let's guard against arrogance and pride. Instead, let us humbly acknowledge God as the source of our blessings. Second, prioritize eternal treasures. Let's be intentional about investing our time, talents, and resources in pursuits that have eternal significance. Whether it's through serving in our church or serving those in need in our communities, how do we share Jesus with more people? And third, share God's blessings. Because God has given us so much, let's be generous in sharing with others who are in need. By demonstrating compassion and generosity, we reflect the character of Jesus and act as his true workers in this world. Thank you, everyone.